Seattle General in Atlanta hums with the kind of silence that only hospitals know, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like mechanical insects, ventilators wheeze clicking from behind closed curtains, shoes squeaking against linoleum that never quite comes clean. Laura Bennett moves through the ER with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned precision under far worse conditions than a chaotic Tuesday morning. Her hands move with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, for placements that never miss, blood work drawn on the first stick, patient assessments completed in half the time it takes other nurses to find a pen. Nobody notices. Nobody ever does. She stops at her locker on the second floor, the one tucked in the far corner of the break room where the fluorescent light burns out and nobody replaces it. Her fingers find the folded flag before her eyes do, muscle memory, not sight. The fabric is heavy cotton, old now, creased from 18 months of touching. She holds it for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then slides it beneath the stack of spare scrubs, hands it the way a priest handles relics. When she pulls her hand back, her fingers are steady. They always are. The scar tissue across her knuckles, shrapnel wounds from a minefield in Baghdad, though nobody here would know what to look for, catches the dim light for a moment, then she rolls down her sleeve and the evidence disappears. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Harris is waiting in room 347, though he doesn't know he's waiting. Doesn't know he's been waiting. The traumatic brain injury stole 3 years of his memory along with his ability to recognize the woman who once carried him bleeding across 300 yards of hostile ground while rounds snapped past like wasps. His left arm is immobilized in a soft cast. His eyes track the monitor above his bed instead of people. The naval officer who once commanded 40 sailors now exists in a present tense that lasts only as long as the conversation does. Laura's handler, a voice on her secure phone at exactly 6:51 a.m. this morning, delivered the assignment in 7 words, Monitor Harris. Naval Intelligence suspects foul play. The training accident that landed Harris in this bed occurred 3 weeks ago, timing that didn't match the official report, and someone in the Pentagon wanted answers quietly. Not quietly enough to explain why they'd activated a deep cover asset, but quietly enough that the hospital had no idea they were harboring a former combat medic. Laura Bennett, RN, with a fake credential paper trail so clean it would pass a federal audit. Captain Laura Bennett, that rank stayed buried with everything else. She enters room 347 at 7:13 a.m. Harris is awake, staring at nothing. How's the pain this morning? Her voice is soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that doesn't make demands. Fine. He doesn't look at her. Same as yesterday. He has no idea it's the same as 18 months ago. The brain doesn't store memories that way anymore. Each day he wakes up to a room he doesn't recognize, to a body that feels wrong, to a life that started this morning and will end when he sleeps. Laura checks his for with the kind of attention to detail that would be excessive in any normal setting, verifying the line, the rate, the fluid, the color, and its routine work, autopilot nursing, except it isn't. She's looking for complications. Looking for signs someone has tried again. The folded flag is still touching her leg through the fabric of her scrubs pocket. She touched it again in the locker room. Twice before that when she thought nobody was looking. Dr. Mercer arrives for morning rounds at 7:42 a.m., trailing residents like a destroyer trailing destroyers. His white coat is crisp enough to cut with a knife. His shoes are Italian leather, she notes the brand automatically, the kind of detail that trained observers notice. His voice is the kind that fills rooms without raising volume, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, all contain power with no need to prove itself. He's been chief of surgery at Seattle General for 9 years, and in 9 years he's become the kind of man who expects people to understand that his time is more valuable than theirs. Laura finishes Harris's morning assessment, vitals normal, O2 sat 98%, no new symptoms, no signs of hemorrhage or infection, and she steps back into the corner where nurses are supposed to disappear. The residents swarm around Harris's bed like remoras. Dr. Mercer reads the chart from the foot of the bed, his eye scanning with the kind of speed that suggests he's not actually reading but performing the act of reading, checking a box that says he looked. Except his eyes pause. They pause on her handwriting. Laura watches this happen with the part of her brain that never really left Baghdad, the part that reads micro-expressions and breathing patterns the way most people read road signs. His eyes are on her vital sign documentation for pages of detailed notes about Harris's responses, his neurological status, the progression of his awareness over the past 72 hours. Most nurses write vitals in boxes. Most nurses write times and numbers and move on. Laura wrote paragraphs. Laura wrote observations that would not normally be the responsibility of a floor nurse. Laura wrote like someone who was assessing a patient for something specific. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightens for exactly 1/10 of a second. Then his face clears. He moves on to the next patient. But something has changed in the room. The air pressure is different somehow. Laura feels it the way soldiers feel incoming fire, a shift in the electromagnetic signature of attention. When she checks her phone 30 minutes later, in the supply closet where the motion sensor light doesn't work, her handler's coded email is already waiting in her secure inbox. Mercer just made 3 calls. 1 to hospital administration. 1 to a number we're still tracing. 1 to a private investigator in Buckhead. Maintain cover. Do not engage. Await further instruction. She deletes the email. The phone self-destructs the message thread. Around 10:16 a.m., during the shift change, Laura walks past room 347 when no one is paying attention. She enters silently, muscle memory, not thought, and checks Harris's billing code against the chart in her hands. Room 347. Occupied since 21 days ago. Code 99213. Established patient office visit, moderate complexity. The code that means the hospital billed Navy insurance for an extended evaluation, the kind of appointment that takes 60 minutes and involves comprehensive assessment. The problem is the chart shows Harris received a basic neurological consult. 23 minutes total. No extended evaluation. No comprehensive assessment. She checks the neighboring rooms while she's there, moving like she's supposed to be there, moving like she knows exactly where she's going. Room 346, patient admitted for pneumonia, billed for pneumonia treatment. Matches. Room 348, admitted for appendicitis, billed for appendectomy and post-operative care. Matches. Room 347, admitted for traumatic brain injury recovery, billed for something else entirely. The billing code is for a procedure. A procedure that costs the insurance company $8,000. A procedure that apparently never happened. Laura closes the chart. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. She has held dying soldiers while rounds snapped past and her own blood soaked her uniform, and that was harder than this, so her hands remain steady and her face remains neutral, and she walks out of room 347 at 10:14 a.m. exactly, carrying a secret that might matter or might be nothing, except her combat training says that billing codes don't get written by accident, and anything worth hiding is worth hiding very carefully. The rubber gloves snap like gunshots when she pulls them off in the trash can. Her badge clattered against the floor hours ago, untouched since. She picks it up now, straightens it, clips it back to her collar where it belongs. Somewhere in this hospital, someone is stealing from the military. Somewhere in this hospital, someone is billing for services that don't exist. And somewhere in this hospital, that same someone is now wondering why a floor nurse took 4 pages of detailed notes about a patient nobody important was supposed to be watching carefully. Laura retrieves the folded flag from her locker at the end of her shift. She holds it for 5 seconds this time instead of 3. The fabric feels heavier today. The weight of it presses against her palm, a reminder of why she accepted this assignment, why she's sleeping for hours a night, why she's spending her daughter's childhood undercover in a hospital in Atlanta instead of the normal life she was supposed to have. The flag belonged to Petty Officer Marcus Webb. He belonged to the kind of people who don't come home. Laura Bennett carried his body across hostile ground, and when she finally made it to the landing zone, her hands were steady enough to pass him to the medics, but not steady enough to do much else for the next 6 months. She tucks the flag back under her scrubs. Her hands are steady now. They always are, when it matters. Tomorrow, Dr. Mercer will begin his moves. Tomorrow, he will start making calls to people who owe him favors. Tomorrow, he will begin the process of making Laura Bennett disappear, because disappearing people is easier than letting them ask questions about billing codes that don't match actual procedures, about money that shouldn't be moving, about $50,000 monthly in insurance fraud that required compliant staff and careful management. But tonight, Laura goes home to her daughter. She makes dinner, a mac and cheese, the kind from a box, and she sits at the kitchen table and she lets her daughter's voice fill the space that should belong to conversation. She listens to stories about second grade and friendship dramas and the teacher who is unfair about math homework. She does not tell her daughter that her mother is someone else. She does not tell her that the reason she's so good at nursing is that she was trained to save lives in conditions where lives ended in seconds. She does not tell her that she's reading the room for threats, for exits, for angles, even now, especially now, because that's what survival training teaches you to do. She just sits at the table and listens, and her hands are steady, and her daughter never suspects that the woman making mac and cheese was once someone else entirely. The tablet came up like an accusation. Dr. Mercer held it high enough that the fluorescent lights caught the screen, throwing his shadow across the Grand Rounds amphitheater where 20 residents sat with their notebooks and their ambitions and their complete lack of understanding about what they were about to witness. Laura stood at the back of the room near the vital signs monitor where she'd been positioning herself for the last 6 weeks, never quite center, never fully integrated, always observing. It was a habit from Baghdad that had never left her. "Nurse Bennett," Mercer announced, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man who'd learned to perform confidence in front of witnesses. "Perhaps you can explain this charting discrepancy to our eager students. Or is attention to detail not taught wherever you received your training?" The residents shifted. Someone's pen clicked. The air conditioning kicked in with a low mechanical hum, and Laura watched the shadows of their discomfort dance across their white coats. Mercer had positioned himself near Harris's bed, her patient, the officer she dragged through 300 yards of Baghdad fire, the man whose blood had soaked into her uniform and whose name she'd whispered like a prayer in the dark. Harris was asleep, unaware that his medical record was about to become a weapon. "I asked you a question, Nurse Clipboard," Mercer continued, and the residents flinched at the nickname. It landed like a slap. Laura could see one of the junior residents, a woman with dark eyes and the kind of careful posture that meant she'd learned to make herself small, wince at the cruelty disguised as humor. Mercer's smile was the smile of a man who'd never been afraid of anything because he'd never had anything real to lose. "Or are you too busy playing detective with billing codes to do your actual job?" The resident stopped taking notes. One of them looked directly at Laura, and she saw the pity there. Pity was a weapon too. Laura waited. This was something she'd learned in combat, that silence had more power than anything you could say with your mouth. She let him finish his performance, watched him milk the moment, watched him turn to his audience for the appreciation that would justify his cruelty. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator in Harris's room wheezing its mechanical rhythm, a steady pulse beneath everything else. When Mercer finally turned back to her, expecting some defensive response, some apology, some breaking of the careful facade she'd maintained for 6 weeks, Laura met his eyes with a flat, cold stare. The kind of stare that came from having stood in the crosshairs and decided that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Strange how passionate you are about a comma splice when you can't explain why room 347 was billed for a procedure the patient never received. She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard his breath catch, that sharp inhalation of a man who'd been slapped in front of his audience and couldn't hide the shock. His face would be reddening now. She didn't need to look to know it. She'd seen that particular transformation before, in the faces of men who'd suddenly realized they were fighting someone who wasn't afraid of them. Laura moved through the hospital corridors with the steady efficiency that no one questioned because they'd learned not to look too closely at the quiet ones. She stopped at the vending machine on the 3rd floor to buy a coffee she didn't want, just to have something to do with her hands, just to move normally through the world while her mind was already 3 steps ahead, already calculating angles. The machine hummed and dispensed her a dark coffee that steamed into the afternoon air, and she was reaching down to retrieve it when 2 doctors she didn't recognize rounded the corner. There's nurse clipboard, one of them stage whispered to the other, loud enough for her to hear, quiet enough to deny it if challenged. Mercer says she thinks she's smarter than the surgeons. They laughed, that specific kind of laughter that bonded them to Mercer, that made them part of his network, part of his world. Laura retrieved her coffee and walked past them without acknowledgement. She'd learned in Baghdad that the most dangerous thing you could do in combat was show weakness by reacting to bait. These were small men playing at influence in the narrowest of kingdoms. She didn't have the energy to care. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, as she moved toward the staff exit, Security Supervisor Davis stepped out from behind the corner of the supply corridor. He was built like someone who'd made a career out of authority without ever quite earning it, and his hand rested on his radio with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequence. Laura could read him instantly, 3 years in law enforcement, angry about a promotion he didn't get, hungry for leverage that might change his trajectory. "Dr. Mercer wants me watching you," Davis said, and his voice was the voice of a man who suddenly felt like he'd been given permission to be unkind. "Says you've been accessing patient files you shouldn't. Next time, I escort you out in cuffs. Clear?" Laura's jaw tightened. She felt the muscle work, felt the control mechanism activate, the same mechanism that had kept her breathing when the IED went off in Fallujah, that had kept her hand steady while shrapnel sang through the air like angry wasps. She said nothing. Sometimes the most powerful response was the absence of one. She left the hospital at 11 p.m. and drove to her apartment in the darkness, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived, hammering the windshield in rhythmic waves. Her phone was dark. No calls from her handler. No messages from the Naval Intelligence operation that had brought her here. The silence had a particular quality to it, the silence of an assignment deteriorating in real time, of a cover story beginning to fray at the edges. She should have been thinking about damage control. She should have been calculating next moves, preparing alternative identities, planning an extraction route. But instead she was thinking about Harris's face when the seizure took him, about the moment when she'd realized that saving his life would simultaneously destroy her mission, that the two things she was supposed to do had become fundamentally incompatible. That was the real trap. That was what Mercer hadn't understood when he decided to target her. He thought he was fighting for resources and territory. He had no idea he was standing next to someone who'd learned survival in an environment where the rules were written in blood and the only currency that mattered was whether people came home. At 4:06 a.m., before dawn broke across Atlanta, Dr. Mercer sat at his desk in a home that had cost him $847,000 and started making calls. First to board member Sterling, who owed him a favor from a carpal tunnel procedure 6 years ago. Then to board member Vasquez, whose daughter had married Mercer's cousin. Then to the state medical board, where he requested an investigation into the credentials of a nurse named Laura Bennett, citing serious concerns about her medical knowledge and suspicious access patterns to confidential patient files. He was competent, this man. Dangerously so. This wasn't rage. This was calculation. This was a network being activated with surgical precision, each call placed with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced a consequence he couldn't talk or buy his way out of. The leading question started small. Where exactly did Nurse Bennett complete her training? He asked the board investigator, whose name was Holloway and whose voice had that particular tone of bureaucratic thoroughness. Has anyone verified her credentials with the institution she claims? Each question was designed like a gate, each one closing off an exit route, each one pushing her story toward the inevitable moment when it would collapse under scrutiny. By dawn, the machinery had been set in motion. The kind of machinery that only worked when everyone involved believed they were on the side of righteousness, when everyone could convince themselves that what they were doing was protocol, procedure, proper institutional function. Mercer sat back in his expensive chair in his expensive house and let the system do what he designed it to do, protect itself, protect him, eliminate the threat. The threat, at that moment, was sleeping in her apartment with her hand pressed against the folded flag she kept hidden beneath her civilian clothes, a piece of fabric that represented the woman she'd been, the one who'd stood in the desert and held her teammate's life in her hands and failed, and had never really stopped failing since then because failure in that context meant people died and you carry that knowledge forever. In exactly 72 hours, that folded flag would mean something different. In exactly 72 hours, people would stop calling her Nurse Clipboard and start using her real title, the one she'd buried so deeply that she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed. But right now, at 5:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Atlanta, Laura Bennett was simply a woman whose mission was about to blow apart, whose cover was about to explode under the weight of a single saved life, whose quiet competence was about to become the most dangerous thing in the room. She didn't know that yet. In the darkness, she only knew that rain was falling and that somewhere in this hospital, the machinery of her own destruction was turning, and that by the time she understood what had happened, the people coming for her would not be the ones she expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects as Laura clocked in at 11:56 p.m. Her hands moved through the routine, badge, ID, the scrub she'd worn for 18 months straight. But tonight felt different. The pull order from her handler sat in her jacket pocket like a loaded weapon. By dawn, she'd be gone. By noon, Mercer's investigation would have shredded every reference, every credential, every carefully constructed identity that kept her close to Harris. She made it as far as the nurse's station before Mercer emerged from the shadows like something that had been waiting. He wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, hospital board members, their expressions already written. One of them wouldn't meet her eyes. That told her everything. The decision was already made. Nurse Bennett. Mercer's voice carried across the floor, loud enough for the night shift to hear. Loud enough for intention. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending credential review. Security will escort you when your shift ends. Until then, you're reassigned to the supply room. No patient contact. Laura's jaw moved once. A single breath. When she spoke, her voice came out flat, measured, already slipping into something older. I understand. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. That restraint, that terrible, controlled composure, was what made Mercer's face darken. He'd expected tears. Panic. A nurse begging to keep her job. Instead, he got a woman who simply nodded and turned toward the supply room like she was heading to get gauze pads. The supply room smelled like bleach and cardboard. Laura stood among the shelves and let herself breathe. 3 years of Navy intelligence work. 8 months of Operation Lighthouse. 18 months of watching Harris through the haze of his traumatic brain injury, waiting for him to remember her. Waiting for the assassin to finish what the initial accident had started. And now she was being pulled. The mission was finished. Failed. She didn't know then that failure wasn't the worst thing that night had planned. At 2:03 a.m., during the window when night shift slowed and the building held its breath between emergencies, Laura heard the monitor alarm from Harris's room 3 floors above. Not from her station. She wasn't supposed to know. She wasn't supposed to care. She wasn't supposed to move. She moved anyway. The stairwell was empty. The corridor silent except for the hum of climate control and the distant beep of a monitor. Harris's room was the 3rd one down. Through the window, she saw the thrashing, not normal movement. Seizure activity. The kind that killed in minutes if nobody intervened. The nurse assigned to Harris wasn't there. That detail registered in the half-second before Laura pushed through the door. Harris's body convulsed against the restraints. His oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone on the monitor, 95, 92, 88. His chest rose only on the left side. Asymmetric. The right side lay flat and still, the way dead things lie. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space. His lung was collapsing. In another 90 seconds, his heart would follow. Laura's hands were already moving. Muscle memory from 14 years ago in Baghdad. From the night she dragged Harris 300 yards through a minefield with shrapnel in her own shoulder and his blood soaking through her uniform. The seizure medication was already in her jacket pocket. She'd kept emergency equipment everywhere, a habit Mercer's rules couldn't break. The 14-gauge angiocath needle was there too. Combat habit. Never leave yourself unarmed. She didn't reach for the call button. She didn't wait for a doctor. She found the landmark, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The needle went in with a small hiss of escaping air, and suddenly Harris could breathe again. The oxygen saturation climbed, 78, 82, 88, 91. His body slackened. The seizure broke. The monitor settled into sinus rhythm. Laura held the needle steady for a count of 10, then withdrew, pressing a gauze pad against the small hole in his chest. Already a nurse was rushing in, the one assigned to his floor, breathless, apologizing. I was getting his medication. I don't know why I wasn't. It's fine. Laura's voice was steady. He's stable now. Call for a chest X-ray. Confirm the pneumothorax is resolved. He'll need 4 fluids. Watch his pressure. She stepped back from the bed. The assigned nurse stared at her, seeing a question she couldn't quite ask. Laura didn't wait for it. She turned and left, her scrub still perfectly white, her hands perfectly steady, a single drop of Harris's blood the only evidence of what she'd just done. By 2:13 a.m., Mercer knew. His phone had recorded the room. He'd been monitoring Harris since the morning's humiliation backfired. He'd seen the unassigned nurse, the supply room nurse, the fired nurse, walk into that room. He'd seen her work with a kind of precision that didn't belong to civilian medical training. He'd seen her do something that no registered nurse in her file had ever been trained to do. Needle decompression. Emergency airway technique. Combat medicine. Mercer stood in the hospital's security office watching the grainy video replay, his hands trembling. Not with fear. With understanding. With the terrible clarity of a man who'd finally seen what he'd been poking at with a stick. This nurse wasn't just hiding something. She was hiding herself. By 3:15 a.m., he'd made the first call. Not to the board members. To someone else. Someone with actual resources. His voice on the phone was different, less arrogant, more desperate. We have a situation. The nurse, Bennett, she performed an emergency medical procedure. Combat-level procedure. I think she's military. I think she's been here on assignment. We need to move now, before. But it was already too late for Mercer to move before anything. In Harris's room, the patient's eyes flickered open. His hand moved slowly, as though through water, toward the small bandage on his ribs. Under it, beneath the antiseptic smell and the hiss of the oxygen cannula, was something his broken mind suddenly remembered. The smell of desert sand and blood. The hands that had held him together when everything else was failing. A voice that had said his name like a prayer in the darkness. Angel. He whispered it into the silence of 3:41 a.m., not knowing the name belonged to a woman bleeding quietly in a supply closet 3 floors below, or that within 14 hours, 50 uniformed Navy personnel would begin arriving at Seattle General, or that what happened next would ensure that Dr. Mercer would never perform surgery again. But that wasn't the worst part for Mercer. The worst part was still coming. It was already on the phone with the Pentagon liaison, already being logged in incident reports that would follow him for the rest of his life, already spreading through social media in a video that would make his face infamous. The worst part was that he'd created the evidence of his own destruction by monitoring the one nurse he should have left alone. Laura's eyes opened to white ceiling tiles and the rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor. Pain radiated through her abdomen in waves, sharp, electric, demanding acknowledgement. She didn't move. The oxygen cannula under her nose whispered cool air. To her left, Davis stood with his arms crossed, his security uniform rumpled, his jaw tight. To her right, bandages wrapped her midsection like a white corset. 2 stab wounds. Chest and flank. 3 inches to the left and the blade would have found her left ventricle. 3 inches down and she'd be bleeding into her peritoneal cavity instead of lying here counting ceiling tiles. The door opened. Dr. Mercer entered, and Laura watched his face go the color of old drywall. He'd expected her to be gone. Not dead, just fired, disgraced, erased from the narrative. Instead, she was still breathing, still a witness, still a problem he couldn't control anymore. His eyes darted to Davis, to the bandages, to her face. He was calculating. Mercer always calculated. "Captain Bennett," he said, and the word came out wrong. He'd caught himself, but too late. His voice cracked like old paint. "I mean, Ms. Bennett. I came to check on." "The orderly," Laura said. Her voice was even. Medication steady in her bloodstream, pain managed, composure intact. "Where is he?" Mercer's jaw clenched. The police apprehended him leaving the emergency stairwell. "He's in custody now, speaking with." "Is he talking?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Yes," Mercer said finally. He's provided a detailed statement about receiving instructions. Specific instructions. About which patient, which room, which time window. Mercer's hand went to the door frame to steady himself. He's very cooperative with law enforcement. Laura understood the calculus. The orderly, a 23-year-old with a juvenile record and a crystal meth addiction, had been hired to create a distraction. A violent incident. Security protocols violated. The patient endangered. Laura's credibility shattered. The investigation into Mercer's billing scheme buried under mountains of liability paperwork and incident reports. Except Laura hadn't died. The patient hadn't died. And the orderly, facing assault and attempted murder charges, was singing like a carnival bird to reduce his sentence. "He gave up your name," Laura said. "Not a question. My attorneys will handle any allegations. This is a vindictive fabrication by a career criminal trying to. He's going to give them the money trail. The offshore account. The pharmacy kickbacks. The surgeries that never happened." Mercer's face tightened. In that moment, Laura saw him fully, not the chief of surgery, not the board member with connections and allies, but a man watching his careful architecture collapse in real time. The network that had seemed so secure, so layered with protection, was unraveling because a junkie facing 25 years wanted to spend 30 in a comfortable federal prison instead. "You have no idea what you've done," Mercer said quietly. "I saved your patient's life," Laura replied. "That's what I did." He left without another word. The door closed like a punctuation mark. Within 4 hours, the hospital's legal team had made their decision. Laura had violated her administrative leave. Entered a patient room without authorization. Created a violent incident on the premises. Created liability exposure. The board, still unaware of Mercer's fraud scheme, agreed that termination was necessary to protect the hospital's insurance coverage and community standing. 24 hours later, a discharge paperwork packet arrived with her name printed in institutional grey. She signed it with her own hand, each letter steady. The pain medication made everything feel distant, like she was watching someone else sign her own dismissal. Davis accompanied her to her locker in the employee break room on seafloor. His discomfort was visible, the way his shoulders curved inward, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "For what it's worth," Davis said as she opened the locker door, "I watched the security footage. You moved like, I don't know, like someone who'd done that before." Laura didn't respond. She pulled down her spare scrubs, folded them carefully, set them aside. Below them, in the shadows where she'd kept it for 3 months, was the folded flag. White cotton, edges frayed. It had belonged to Lieutenant Commander Samuel Torres, who'd caught shrapnel meant for her in Fallujah. She picked it up. Her hands began to tremble, the first time anyone at Seattle General would see physical evidence that the composed, efficient nurse was capable of weakness. "You're leaving," Davis said. Statement, not question. "I'm leaving." She placed the flag in a paper bag, gathered her belongings, and walked out through the employee entrance where rain was beginning to fall. Her apartment was 6 miles away. She drove with one hand, the other cradling her bandaged side. The pain medication made the streetlights blur into watercolor impressions. She couldn't call her handler. That line was closed now. She couldn't contact Harris. That was against protocol. She couldn't do anything except drive home and wait for the legal consequences to materialize. At the kitchen table, evening light angled through the windows. She'd been sitting there for 2 hours when the key turned in the lock. Her daughter appeared, 7 years old, backpack still on her shoulders, confusion spreading across her face like a stain. "Mommy." The small voice contained every question Laura didn't have answers for. "Why are you home when it's still light outside? Are you sick?" Laura tried to speak. The words wouldn't form. She was looking at the folded flag on the table in front of her, at the cotton that had wrapped a man's last duty, at the symbol of everything she'd sacrificed and everyone she'd failed. She'd carried 3 wounded sailors through a minefield. She'd saved Harris twice. And because she'd done her job too well, because she'd noticed too much, because she was the kind of person who couldn't look away from injustice, she'd lost her career, failed her mission, and now had to explain to a 7-year-old why her mother was crying at the kitchen table at 4 in the afternoon. She reached out and pulled her daughter close, pressing her face into her daughter's hair, breathing in the smell of school and innocence. The tears came silently, the kind that don't make noise, the kind that come from places too deep for sound. "Mommy loves you," she whispered. "Mommy just needs a minute." But a minute turned into hours, and the flag stayed on the table, and Lieutenant Commander Harris remained in room 347 with no memory of the woman who'd saved him, now vulnerable to whatever darkness had tried to take him before. The investigation into his attempted murder would continue without her. The fraud scheme investigation would proceed through legal channels while she fought unemployment proceedings and assault trauma. She'd traded everything, her cover, her career, her daughter's security, to save a man who wouldn't remember her name. This was the lowest point. The place where heroes discover that saving lives doesn't always save your own. 3 days later, Laura pushed a cardboard box across the tile floor of Seattle General's basement locker room, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge above her head. Hospital security stood at the doorway, not hostile, just present, watching her pack away 12 years of carefully constructed lies. The stab wounds beneath her jacket pulled tight as she reached for the folded flag hidden beneath her spare scrubs, the fabric so worn it felt like paper in her hands. 2,400 hours. That was how long she'd been undercover. That was how long she'd carried this flag, this memorial to Petty Officer Marcus Chen, who died in her arms in Baghdad with her name on his lips. The box held nothing remarkable. 2 pairs of compression socks. A stethoscope. Trauma shears with military-grade steel. A challenge coin from the 75th Ranger Regiment buried beneath a hospital ID badge that wasn't even her real name. The security guard shifted his weight, impatient. She had 45 minutes before her temporary access revoked permanently. Before Captain Laura Bennett ceased to exist and became nobody again. Her daughter wouldn't understand. Not yet. At 7 years old, she only knew that Mommy came home early and wore bandages and sat very still at the dinner table. She'd asked once, in that small confused voice that children used when the world made no sense, "Mommy, why are you sad?" Laura had pressed her hand against the bandage wound beneath her shirt and said nothing, because the truth was too heavy for a child to carry. The folded flag went into the box last. Then she heard it, a single word, whispered from outside the locker room door. A voice she dragged 300 yards through hostile fire to save. A voice that had been silent for 3 days while traumatic brain injury kept him locked away from himself. "Angel." Laura's hand stilled. She didn't turn. The security guard straightened. "Angel." The voice came again, stronger now. "Laura? Your name is Laura." She turned to see Lieutenant Commander Harris in his wheelchair, pushed by a hospital orderly, not the one who'd stabbed her. That one was in federal custody, and his eyes were clear for the first time since his training accident. His eyes were remembering. His memory had fought through the swelling and the trauma and the surgeon's worst predictions, and it had clawed its way back to consciousness. The scar on his forehead was still angry red, still healing, but behind it, behind all of it, Lieutenant Commander James Harris was coming back home to himself. "Hi, sir," Laura said. Her voice was level. Her hands didn't shake. This was composure. This was what 12 years of battlefield medicine taught you: control your breathing, control your voice, control everything except what mattered. You saved me. He stared at her like she might disappear. In Baghdad. You dragged me through the minefield. You got Sanchez out. You got Daniels out. His voice cracked. You got me out. Your name was on my lips when the IED went off. Angel Bennett. That was the last thing I remembered before the nightmare. You. The security guard looked confused. Laura said nothing. She closed the box. Then the doors to Seattle General's main lobby burst open behind them. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of 50 pairs of military-issue footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. The air pressure changed as they entered, that subtle shift that comes when apex predators recognize their own kind in a room. A Marine gunnery sergeant in dress blues approached Laura with the formal precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, and he carried a leather folder that smelled like diesel exhaust and government seals. "Captain Bennett," he said. "Not Ms. not nurse. Captain." "Gunnery sergeant." Her voice dropped an octave. The mask slipped for a second. 12 years of civilian nurse voice evaporated, replaced by something steel-edged and certain. The security guard's eyes widened. The gunnery sergeant opened the folder and his voice carried through the hallway like he was addressing a battalion. His words bounced off the fluorescent lights, echoed against the linoleum, and hung in the air like a benediction nobody expected. Captain Laura and Bennett, for extraordinary heroism under fire in Baghdad, Jolan District, continuing medical care while sustaining shrapnel wounds to the lower abdomen and left shoulder, carrying 3 wounded sailors through an active minefield under sustained hostile fire, demonstrating medical competence and tactical awareness under conditions that would have broken most warriors in half. The Silver Star. The Purple Heart. Twice. Behind him stood a rear admiral in full dress whites, her shoulders heavy with brass, her eyes the color of storm clouds. She stepped forward with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to command, and when she raised her hand to salute, not a casual gesture but a full, rigid acknowledgement of rank and sacrifice, every one of the 50 uniformed sailors behind her mirrored the movement. The right hands rose like a single organism, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in Harris's room humming 3 floors above. Dr. Mercer emerged from the stairwell at the precise moment the rear admiral's hand touched her brow. His face went the color of old paper. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again with the expression of a man watching his entire existence collapse into rubble. Behind him came a Pentagon liaison in a suit that cost more than Mercer's monthly salary, codes visible in the manila folder she carried, classified designations that made the rear admiral's expression sharpen with what might have been approval. "Dr. Mercer," the liaison said. Her voice was like a knife sliding through silk. "These documents detail the classified Naval Intelligence assignment of Captain Bennett, her operational security clearance, her service record, and the attempted murder of a witness in federal custody. Your department is under full federal audit as of 0600 hours this morning. You are suspended pending investigation. The orderly you hired to." Mercer stepped backward. His mouth worked without sound. He'd orchestrated her firing with surgical precision 48 hours ago. He'd made calls to board members, contacted her references, brought in state investigators to destroy her credibility. He'd built an empire on $50,000 monthly in kickbacks, and he'd done it so carefully, so methodically, with allies on every board and investors in every pocket. He'd looked at Captain Laura Bennett, tired, quiet, just a nurse, and he'd seen nothing. He'd looked right through her. He had no idea who he was standing next to. "I was following protocol," Mercer said. "She assaulted a superior officer with a medical procedure without authorization. You attempted to silence a witness." The liaison's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You hired your orderly to eliminate Lieutenant Commander Harris because he overheard you discussing kickbacks with a medical supply contractor. You constructed an elaborate fraud network across 4 hospitals. You fired a decorated combat veteran while she was actively serving her country in an undercover capacity. And you did all of this believing no one would ever find out who she really was. The Rear Admiral turned to Mercer and said exactly 5 words, "Your career is over, Doctor." By evening, the video had been uploaded to social media. 50 service members standing at attention in a hospital lobby. A Marine reading a military citation. A Rear Admiral saluting. And Dr. Mercer's face, that moment when he realized, going absolutely white. 2 million views by midnight. 10 million by the next morning. News helicopters circled Seattle General by 6 a.m., their rotor wash shaking the windows like distant thunder. That's when Dr. Patricia Owens, retired Navy surgeon and the woman who'd trained Mercer 20 years ago, who'd taught him everything about the human body and surgical technique and institutional power, saw the video. She'd made him, in a way. She believed in him. And she watched him attempt to interrupt a military decoration ceremony for a combat veteran he'd just fired. Her phone call to the hospital board came at 0730 hours. Her voice was quiet, which made it infinitely worse than shouting. "I taught that man everything he knows about surgery," Dr. Owens said. "And I'm formally disavowing him. His conduct is disgraceful. I want a full audit of his surgical department, his billing codes, his relationships with medical suppliers, his entire operation. If he's the kind of doctor who would fire a wounded warrior in the middle of a classified federal assignment, then he's the kind of doctor who would do anything for money. And I won't have my name associated with that legacy." The board moved fast. Within 72 hours, the billing discrepancies Laura had noticed, the phantom procedures, the inflated costs, the kickbacks, became obvious under scrutiny. The orderly's confession in federal custody connected the attempted murder to Mercer's fraud network. Harris's overheard conversation about medical supplier kickbacks provided motive. The network collapsed like a house built on sand. For other surgeons at Seattle General came forward with their own stories. Mercer had pressured them to falsify procedures. Mercer had demanded kickbacks from medical supply contractors. Mercer had created a culture of coercion and silence for nearly 7 years. $50,000 monthly in fraud. 17 arrests across 4 hospitals. $2.3 million in recovered funds. Dr. Mercer's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. The hospital board banned him from the building. His carefully constructed empire disintegrated in 72 hours. On the evening news, cameras caught him leaving through the staff exit, and he no longer wore the white coat of authority. He was just another man facing federal charges, his future measured in prison time instead of surgical schedules. But that wasn't the reckoning. That wasn't the moment that mattered most. 6 months later, Captain Laura Bennett stood in Navy dress whites at Naval Intelligence headquarters, her stab wounds healed to thin silver scars that caught the light when she moved. Her daughter sat in the front row, beaming with pride, finally understanding why Mommy's uniform looked different from all the other uniforms. Why Mommy's chest carried medals that caught the auditorium lights like small captured suns. The folded flag from Petty Officer Marcus Chen now rested in a shadow box on the wall behind the podium, a permanent memorial to the man she couldn't save, the sacrifice that had launched her into this life of hidden strength and classified duty. A Rear Admiral handed her a commendation for completing her mission despite operational compromise. The orderly's arrest had broken the entire conspiracy to silence Lieutenant Commander Harris. The fraud investigation was ongoing, but the immediate threat was neutralized. She'd done the job. She'd brought Harris home. Lieutenant Commander Harris stood beside her in his dress blues, fully recovered, his traumatic brain injury resolved through months of intensive therapy, his memory fully restored. His arm bore a new tattoo beneath his uniform sleeve, Captain Angel Bennett with 2 dates. The day she saved him in Baghdad. The day she took 2 stab wounds defending him in Seattle. The Admiral made a point of shaking his hand, of acknowledging his recovery, of recognizing what it meant to have your life saved twice by the same warrior. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," the Admiral said to the assembled crowd. Captain Bennett saw the worst in Baghdad. She's been seeing the worst her entire life. And she never stopped giving. Never stopped protecting. Never stopped being the kind of soldier we all aspire to become. When the ceremony ended and the cameras shut down, Harris hugged her, careful of her healing wounds but genuine in his gratitude, and Laura let herself breathe for the first time in 6 months. Her daughter rushed forward, wrapping small arms around her mother's waist, finally understanding why Mommy had come home with blood on her shirt that day, why she'd cried silently at the kitchen table with a folded flag in her hands. Understanding that Mommy was a hero. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more stories of overlooked warriors who protected others while protecting classified assignments. Like this video if you believe the quietest people in the room are sometimes the most dangerous. And comment below, tell us about a hero in your own life, someone who fought against corruption, someone who protected others at great personal cost, someone the world didn't see coming. Use #AngelBennett and let's honor the ones who serve in silence.